Are you ready to fall asleep to these scary stories? Before you fall asleep, make sure you subscribe to my channel and like this video. And don't forget to tell me in the comments what time you're watching and where you're watching from. Sleep well. I'm a 37-year-old mom of two. My son, Alex, 12, and my daughter, Mia, 14. A few months ago, Mia had a procedure at a private hospital to remove her impacted wisdom teeth, requiring general anesthesia due to how embedded they were. The doctor warned it'd be a long process, which neither Mia nor I were thrilled about. While she was recovering, I waited alongside my brother-in-law, Tom, who came along to support us, keeping Alex company as we waited for Mia to wake up. Now, those who have been around someone coming out of anesthesia know that people can say some wild, out-of-character things in that hazy state. I'll admit, I was hoping for a laugh or two from Mia's loopy remarks. But what she actually said was horrifying. First, some background. My late husband, Chris, loved to take our family whitewater rafting with his brother Tom. Though I joined sometimes, work usually kept me back. Chris wasn't the strongest swimmer, so I often worried about him on these trips. Tragically, in early 2022, my worst fear was realized. Chris was pulled under by a current, and by the time Tom could get to him, it was too late. Life without Chris has been unimaginably hard, but Mia seemed to be the one who changed most after losing him. She became quieter, almost withdrawn. Yet Tom stepped in, a constant presence, going above and beyond to support us. I was grateful. Grateful that my kids had someone else they could lean on, even as I struggled myself. So, when Mia finally started to come around in her hospital bed, I was just relieved to see her waking up, even if she was dazed and mumbling. I asked softly, "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Mia, eyes drooping and hazy, looked right through me. She seemed lost, almost fixated on an empty spot in the corner of the room. I thought she was just out of it, so I gently reminded her, "We're at the hospital, remember?" She mumbled something, a whisper about the man. Thinking she might mean the doctor, I assured her that Dr. Gray would check on her soon. But she repeated it, the phrase chilling in its insistence. Not the doctor, the man. Suddenly, Mia's gaze locked with mine, and with a raspy voice she revealed, "Dad didn't drown. He said he'll hurt us if I tell you." A moment of stunned silence. Even the nurse at her bedside seemed taken aback. Something in Mia's voice, the eerie calmness, felt far too real to dismiss as anesthesia talk. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it must be the drugs talking. But my mind kept returning to last Christmas when Tom, drunk and, he claimed, misreading signals, tried to make a pass at me. I brushed it off at the time, considering the grief we'd both endured. Yet, more moments replayed in my head. Times when Tom's presence was so constant it began to feel unsettling. He'd stay over often claiming the kids wanted him to be around, staying long after I'd feel comfortable. But Mia's words had unlocked something I couldn't ignore. "Are you sure you're okay, Mia?" I asked, trembling. Her hand shook as she lifted her sleeve, revealing a faded scar on her arm. "He said I couldn't tell you, Mom. He'd hurt me. And Alex." She pointed to the scar, explaining how it wasn't from rafting, like Tom had once claimed. I'd accepted his story because I had no reason not to, but now all I saw was an unspoken truth in Mia's haunted eyes. I looked at the nurse, who had grown visibly tense. She excused herself, but returned moments later, strangely silent and pale. Panicked, I darted into the hallway to find Alex, but Tom was nowhere in sight. Where had he gone? I rushed back to Mia's room, helping her up and telling her we were leaving. But as I stepped around her bed, my shoes slipped in something wet. My heart dropped as I looked down to see a dark, spreading pool of blood. I followed its trail, lifting the partitioning curtain, and saw the body of Nurse Karen. Her eyes gone, blood pooling where they should have been. I stifled a scream, unable to even process what I was seeing, when Mia, struggling to keep her balance, pointed shakily toward the far corner. There, almost blending into the shadows, sat Tom. "You thought I wouldn't come for you," he murmured, his voice a low, sinister drawl. "Chris knew. He knew I'd be the one to take care of you." Panic surged. "Run!" I screamed to the kids, barely able to register their footsteps as they scrambled toward the door. Tom lunged at me, pinning me to the bed and driving a sharp, cold blade into my side. I felt searing pain as he leaned close, whispering in my ear, "I'll keep you safe from here on out. I've always been here, waiting for this." With what strength I had left, I pulled my keys from my pocket, gripping them between my fingers, and drove them into his neck, again and again. He stumbled back, choking on his own blood, as I stabbed until he fell, lifeless, beside me. By the time emergency responders arrived, Tom was dead. They counted 46 stab wounds. Some called it a crime of passion, but I knew I did what I had to. I protected my family. Now, in the quiet of my home, I still feel his presence, haunting my memories of Chris, of what was once a peaceful life. But I have my children with me, and I know that we're safe now. This happened when I was around 12. My family and I had traveled to Malaysia to visit relatives who lived in Sarawak. My family is known for their deep spiritual beliefs and rich traditions. Stories of spirits and supernatural encounters were common in our household, passed down through generations. Almost everyone in my family had a tale of an encounter, be it a whisper in the night or a shadow glimpsed from the corner of the eye. Me, being a skeptic at that age, thought these stories were just ways to scare kids into behaving. One of my uncles ran a small money transfer business, exchanging foreign currency for Malaysian ringgit. His work often took him to nearby neighboring cities like Cebu or Selangor, and I looked up to him so much that I'd tag along whenever he let me. One night, during a family dinner, my uncle mentioned he needed to meet a business partner in Cebu the following week. He asked if I wanted to come along, and of course, I jumped at the chance. A few days later, we left for Cebu. If you've never been, Cebu is beautiful. Even now, I go back just to soak in the atmosphere whenever my mom and I visit Malaysia. It's a city surrounded by dense jungles, rivers, and mountains, and it has this quiet, almost mystical charm to it. Anywho, most of the trip passed in a blur, as it just consisted of me following my uncle to different venues and eating as much local food as I could. I vividly remember the smell of freshly grilled satay and the sound of street vendors calling out to passers-by. But eventually, it was time to head home. The drive back started out quiet and peaceful. It was late, and after the excitement of the trip, I was drowsy. You know those car rides where you can feel the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car pulling you into sleep. That is exactly what happened to me as I began resting my head on the seatbelt and slowly closed my eyes, drifting into a deep slumber, until I woke up. There was a sound. Knocking. sharp, insistent knocks that jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open, and I instantly realized something was wrong. I was still in the car, but we were driving along a winding road on a mountainside, the dark trees closing in around us like shadows stretching into the night. I glanced at my uncle. His face was tense. His eyes focused on the road, but both hands were clenched on the wheel. Normally, he'd have the radio on, humming along to some tune, but now the car was dead silent. I heard the knocks again, this time from the back right window. The sound was too loud and deliberate to be pebbles or branches hitting the glass. I looked back, trying to make sense of it, but before I could fully turn, my uncle's voice cut through the air, cold and stern. 𝗕𝗂𝘀𝗶𝗹. Look forward. I froze. He sounded different, like he was barely holding back a tremor. His voice was unnervingly calm, but there was a sense of urgency in it that made my heart race. He told me to keep my eyes forward, to look down if I had to, but not to turn around. My stomach twisted. Confusion and fear swirled together as the knocks grew louder. They started on the back window, then moved to the front, then to the other side. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like something was trying to make its presence known, like it wanted to get in. My hands clenched the seat, my body trembling, and I felt the overwhelming urge to turn around, to see what was causing the noise. But my uncle's command echoed in my head, louder than the knocking, and I fought the instinct to look. Then, as if on cue, the knocking escalated. It wasn't just from one window anymore, it was coming from every window. The sound was deafening, each knock more forceful than the last. The noise drowned out the engine, the trees, everything. My chest tightened, and I could feel tears starting to slip down my cheeks. My uncle's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white as he accelerated, the engine roaring louder as he tried to outrun whatever was out there. But no matter how fast we went, the knocking didn't stop. It only grew louder. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat a reminder that we weren't alone. I didn't dare to look out the windows, but I could feel something watching us, something close enough to touch. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence. In an instant, the knocking ceased, and the world seemed to return to its natural state. The only sound left was my uncle's shaky breath and the low rumble of the car's engine. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I could barely catch my breath as the car continued down the mountain road. My uncle kept his eyes fixed on the road, his face pale, his jaw clenched. I don't remember much of the rest of the drive. My uncle kept talking, forcing a conversation about school, about friends. Anything to distract us from the eerie silence that had fallen over us. I could tell he was trying to remain calm, but there was something in his eyes. Something that said he, too, had experienced something beyond explanation. Years later, I came back to visit my hometown with my mom, and one night, my uncle finally told me the full story. He explained that the mountain road we'd driven on was known to be haunted, though he had never told me this before. It was a quiet place with little to no traffic, surrounded by thick jungle and dense trees. He admitted that while I slept, he had seen something. A flash of black in the rearview mirror, almost like a shadow darting across the back seat. And just before I woke up, he'd heard it too. A whisper from somewhere behind us, soft and chilling. 𝗕𝗂𝘀𝘶𝗶𝗃. It still gives me chills to this day, knowing that the warning never came from him. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to protect us, trying to make sure we didn't see what was lurking just outside of our vision. Whatever it was, it stayed with me. a lingering reminder that some things in this world are better left unseen. After a recent promotion, I moved into an unexpectedly affordable, spacious old townhouse. It had been vacant for years, but after a few minor renovations, it seemed perfect. The house was oddly designed, with narrow hallways, high ceilings, and an unusual number of small, dark rooms. A week into my new life there, I began noticing small things off. Keys, books, and objects I'd left in one place would be moved. Initially, I dismissed it as forgetfulness. But then, one night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint thumping coming from inside the walls. It sounded like footsteps, but there was no one else there. The next day, I investigated the house, trying to find the source of the noise. Down a dark hallway on the second floor, I discovered something odd. A barely visible outline of a door, hidden beneath layers of paint. Curiosity led me to push it open, and to my surprise, it creaked, revealing a narrow, dust-choked staircase that led up to a long-forgotten attic room. Compelled by an unshakable curiosity, I climbed the creaky stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room at the top was small, cluttered with broken furniture, old toys, and dusty family portraits. But one thing stood out: a bed in the corner, perfectly made as though it had been used recently. A foul, rotting smell lingered in the air, and the walls were covered in unsettling, childlike drawings. Figures with hollow eyes, twisted smiles, and long, spindly limbs. As I turned to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I froze when I saw something scratched into the floor. "Don't look at them." Heart racing, I convinced myself it was just graffiti, but I fled the room, slamming the hidden door shut behind me. Over the following nights, the atmosphere grew worse. I woke up frequently, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. Sometimes I heard faint whispers from the forgotten room, and on one occasion I could have sworn I heard a child's laugh echoing through the walls. Then, one night, as I lay in bed, I opened my eyes to see a shadow standing at the foot of my bed, an unnervingly small figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile, just like the drawings. It stared at me, grinning. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just as I felt the weight of terror almost suffocate me, the figure leaned closer, whispering, "You looked." I blinked, and the shadow vanished, but the feeling of dread lingered. I spent the rest of the night on my living room floor, clutching a flashlight, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I called a contractor in desperation, demanding he seal the hidden room. He quickly plastered over the door, hiding it once again. Relieved, I finally felt safe enough to breathe again. But that night, as I prepared for bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the wall above my bed, drawn with invisible fingers, were two hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Familiar. In jagged handwriting were the words, "I'm still watching." I left the house the following morning, never returning. Though I moved on with my life, I could never escape the nagging feeling that somewhere, someone, or something was still watching me, waiting. For the moment I dared to look again. My father and I had a unique routine when I was a kid. Late-night walks through our neighborhood. They started when I was young and continued for years, all because of his insomnia, a side effect of his long shifts at the factory. Our neighborhood was mostly safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. where streetlights dotted the roads and dogs barked from fenced yards. Most of it was your typical suburban scene, except for one stretch of road that always felt different. This particular road lay at the very edge of the neighborhood, curving around a dense forest that stretched back for miles. There were no houses there, no traffic, just a single overgrown plot of land with a rusted gate and wild vegetation creeping over it. It stood out because, even though it was deserted, one flickering streetlight still illuminated a small patch of it. We walked this path often, despite its eerie vibe. My dad said he liked the silence of the woods, and I just liked being with him, even though the place always made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, everything changed. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the moon hung low, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. My dad and I set out as usual, walking down the familiar streets, our breaths fogging the cool air. We turned onto the forest road, the darkness closing in as the distance between streetlights grew wider. The wind rustled the leaves, and aside from the occasional owl hooting, it was quiet. Just the two of us in the stillness of the night. As we neared the overgrown plot, my dad suddenly stopped mid-stride. His body went rigid, his grip on my hand tightening so much it hurt. I opened my mouth to ask what was wrong, but before I could utter a word, he put a hand over my mouth, crouching down and pulling me with him into the shadows. His reaction was so sudden and out of character that fear gripped me instantly. My dad had always been the calm, rational one, the person who shrugged off anything remotely frightening. But now, his eyes were wide, darting between the trees, his breathing quick and shallow. "Stay quiet," he whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. I followed his gaze, trying to figure out what had spooked him. At first, I saw nothing. Just the same eerie, flickering streetlight casting its pale glow over the tangled weeds and brush of the abandoned lot. But then, something moved. My heart skipped a beat. From the shadows near the edge of the illuminated area, a figure stepped out, barely visible in the dim light. It was small, no taller than 3 feet, and unnaturally thin, its limbs long and awkward. At first, I thought it might be a child, lost and wandering. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its movements were jerky, almost animalistic, and its skin, it didn't look right. It was pale, almost gray, and seemed to shimmer under the flickering light. I felt a scream building in my throat, but my father's hand tightened over my mouth. His eyes were wide with fear, and I could feel his entire body trembling beside me. As I stared, frozen in terror, the small figure slowly scanned its surroundings, its head moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. Then it raised a long, bony arm and made a gesture, a signal. My blood ran cold as from the darkness behind it, 2 more figures emerged, identical to the first. They were cautious, stepping lightly, their eyes, if they had eyes, locked on the forest just beyond the light. The 3 creatures stood huddled together for a moment, whispering to each other in soft, guttural sounds that I couldn't make sense of. I strained to hear, but the language, if it was a language, wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was chilling, like the wind howling through a crack in a door, unnatural. There's an old urban legend about seeing black dogs or so-called hellhounds, and if you encounter one 3 times, it's believed to be an omen of death. Though I've always been skeptical of such stories, There was one night that left me questioning whether I'd come face to face with something supernatural. It happened a few years ago, and even now, the memory sends a chill down my spine. I might have seen one of these legendary creatures, though I tried my best to convince myself otherwise. It was just a typical evening walk with our old family dog, a routine I'd done hundreds of times before. Our neighborhood is a strange mix of urban streets and wooded areas, with some parts well lit by streetlights and others swallowed up by pockets of darkness. As we walked, I suddenly felt an unsettling sensation, like someone or something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though no one else seemed to be around. As I continued walking, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. When I reached a hill, the streetlights became sparser, and the shadows stretched longer, giving the area an eerie vibe. My nerves were getting the best of me, so I decided to stop and look around, just to put my mind at ease. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the shadows, a large black dog stood completely still, watching me. It was massive, resembling a German shepherd, but it was almost as if its fur absorbed the light, making it look more like a shadow than a living creature. My heart raced, and I quickly bent down to pick up my dog, half expecting the black dog to come closer. But when I looked up again, it was gone. There hadn't been any sound, no footsteps, no rustling of leaves, nothing to indicate where it went or how it disappeared so quickly. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished without a trace. The silence that followed was so heavy, it was as if the entire street had been holding its breath. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a stray dog that had slipped away quietly, or maybe it had run off into the woods. But the odd part was that I hadn't heard anything. No claws against the pavement, no scurrying into the underbrush. It was just gone, as if it had never been there at all. That eerie feeling I'd had just moments before only deepened, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever I saw wasn't entirely of this world. Even now, I still think about that night. I've walked that same route dozens of times since then, but I've never seen that black dog again. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light, or a stray that vanished before I could make sense of it. But the way it made me feel, the way it seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly, left me with a lingering sense of unease. Whether it was just an ordinary dog or something more, I'll never truly know. But that shadowy figure still haunts the edges of my thoughts, leaving me to wonder if there's more truth to the old legends than I once believed. When I was around 10 or 11, I played in a little league baseball team that my dad coached. It was a big part of my childhood, and I have a lot of fond memories of those days. One of the fields we played on was tucked behind a school that sat right in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The field itself was pretty ordinary, but what made it stand out was the small patch of forest on one side, which always seemed a bit mysterious to me as a kid. I remember my teammates and I would often wander near the edge of the trees after our games, feeling drawn to its shadowy atmosphere, but we rarely ventured too far inside. One evening, after one of our games had wrapped up, I wandered over to the playground near the school while waiting for my dad to finish chatting with the other coaches. I remember the fading light of the day giving everything a soft orange glow. The air was cooling down, and the field was starting to empty as families headed home. I was absent-mindedly playing on the swings when something caught my eye. I glanced over toward the forest and saw a figure that immediately gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. It was a woman, or at least that's what she looked like from a distance. She was around 5 to 6 feet tall, wearing a thick black hoodie that seemed out of place for the time of year. She was walking quickly, almost running, toward the trees. But what really grabbed my attention was the way she was holding her hands over her face, as if she was either trying to hide something or shielding herself from something unseen. At first, I thought maybe she was upset or hurt, but then she turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. And that's when I saw her eyes. They were huge, unnaturally large, and bright yellow, like the eyes of a cat. The way they stood out, even from a distance, was startling. They were the kind of eyes that didn't just reflect the light. They seemed to glow on their own, almost giving her a surreal, otherworldly look. For a moment, I felt frozen, just staring in disbelief at what I was seeing. She disappeared into the trees without a sound, and I snapped out of my daze. I wanted to tell someone, but I wasn't sure what I had just witnessed. My young mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Could it have been my imagination playing tricks on me? Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe I had seen her wrong. But the image of her, especially those unnerving eyes, felt so clear and real. It wasn't like other childhood memories that fade or blur with time. This one stuck with me, vivid and unsettling. After that day, I didn't talk about it much. At that age, it's easy to dismiss strange experiences as just a product of an overactive imagination, and that's exactly what I tried to do. I told myself I must have been tired after the game, or maybe I'd just seen a reflection off her glasses or something like that. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw was something more than just a random person. Over the years, that memory has lingered in the back of my mind. Sometimes I'll catch myself thinking about it when I'm alone, or when I see something that reminds me of that day. The strange part is that I can still remember her so clearly, the way she moved, the way her hands covered her face, and especially those piercing yellow eyes. They didn't look like they belonged to a person, and the more I think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Now, as an adult, I still don't have an explanation for what I saw. I've tried to reason it away, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But the memory hasn't faded. I've heard stories of strange encounters in forests, tales of people seeing things they can't explain, but I've never come across anything quite like what I experienced that evening behind the school. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or maybe there are things out there that we can't fully understand. Either way, that memory has stayed with me all these years, and I'm not sure it will ever truly go away. The night was thick with an unsettling silence as I ventured into the woods behind my childhood home. I had grown up hearing stories about the strange creatures that lurked in the shadows of those trees. Tales of cryptids that were said to roam the area, especially after dark. My friends often teased me about these legends, calling them silly folklore, but the stories had stuck with me. They were the kind of stories that sent a shiver down your spine, and I felt a mix of excitement and fear as I prepared to explore the woods on my own. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of adventure, I set out just after sunset, the last rays of daylight fading behind the tall pines. The trees loomed over me, casting eerie shadows that danced with every gust of wind. As I moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world outside faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. It was quiet, almost too quiet. and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart raced, and I reminded myself that I was just being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild. After wandering for what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small clearing. The moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the area in a silvery glow. I took a moment to catch my breath and enjoy the tranquility of the forest. But just as I began to relax, I heard a low growl echo through the trees. My heart dropped, and I froze in place, the hair on my arms standing on end. It was a sound I had never heard before, deep, guttural, and filled with an unmistakable menace. Instinctively, I shone my flashlight into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had made that noise. To my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at me from the edge of the clearing. They were impossibly large and seemed to hover just above the ground. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a tree root. The creature remained hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. As I tried to process what I was seeing, the creature stepped into the light. It was unlike anything I had ever encountered. It stood about 7 feet tall, with a gaunt, emaciated frame covered in matted, dark fur. Its limbs were elongated, and it moved with an unnatural grace that sent chills down my spine. The face was the most horrifying part. It had a snout similar to that of a wolf, but was twisted and elongated, with sharp yellow teeth glistening in the moonlight. I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. It felt like something straight out of a nightmare. I wanted to run, to escape back to the safety of my home, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. The creature tilted its head, studying me with those menacing eyes, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It let out another low growl, more of a warning this time, and I finally found the strength to turn and flee. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced through the trees, branches scratching at my skin and the underbrush snagging at my feet. As I ran, I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footfalls echoing through the woods. It was gaining on me, and fear propelled me forward, pushing me past the limits of my endurance. I darted through the trees, my mind racing with thoughts of how I could escape. The darkness felt alive, and every shadow seemed to hide another pair of eyes watching me. I didn't dare look back. I could only focus on putting distance between myself and the terrifying creature that seemed intent on following me. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the woods and into the open field behind my house. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted straight for my front door, fumbling with the lock as panic surged through me. Finally, I managed to get inside and slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to calm my racing heart. The silence of my home felt deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos I had just escaped. I could hardly believe what had just happened, my mind struggling to accept the reality of the encounter. For days afterward, I was haunted by the experience. I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. The way it moved, the chilling sound of its growl, and those glowing eyes that seemed to bore into my very soul. I found myself avoiding the woods even during the day, convinced that whatever I had seen was still lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. Friends and family dismissed my story, laughing off the idea of cryptids and monsters, but I knew what I had experienced was real. The encounter changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I became more cautious and hyper-aware of my surroundings, especially when I was outside. The woods, which had once been a place of adventure, transformed into a realm of fear and uncertainty. I started researching local legends and other sightings of cryptids, hoping to find some answers or reassurance that I wasn't alone in my experience. It seemed I wasn't the first person to encounter something strange in those woods. Others had shared similar tales, each more chilling than the last. While I may never fully comprehend what I encountered that night, I know one thing for certain. Some mysteries are best left unexplored, and some creatures are best left undisturbed. The legend of the cryptid that stalked me through the woods will always be a part of my story, a reminder that the world is filled with unknowns, lurking just beyond our understanding. And every time I pass those woods, I can't help but feel a shiver run down my spine, knowing that some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the dark. When I was in college, a group of friends and I decided to take a weekend camping trip in a remote area, known for its natural beauty and rumored supernatural happenings. Nestled deep in the heart of the woods, the campsite was surrounded by towering trees and serene silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of wildlife. Despite the picturesque setting, there was a lingering sense of unease that none of us could quite shake off, thanks in part to the local folklore surrounding the area. Stories of cryptids and strange creatures that were said to roam the forest after dark. After setting up our tents and gathering around the campfire, we began sharing ghost stories and legends we had heard over the years. One tale in particular caught my attention. It was about a creature known as the Wendigo, a spirit said to haunt the woods, preying on those who ventured too far into its territory. According to the legend, the Wendigo was a gaunt, skeletal figure with glowing eyes and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The more we talked, the more I could feel the chill in the air deepen, and I began to wonder if there was some truth to these stories. As night fell, we settled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire fading as the darkness enveloped us. I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone. The sounds of the forest seemed to change, growing more pronounced as the night wore on. The wind whispered through the branches, and I could hear the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. It was as if the forest was alive, watching us as we slept, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. At around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud commotion outside our tents. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound of rustling leaves and heavy footfalls echoed through the darkness, accompanied by frantic whispers from my friends. I unzipped the tent and peered outside, my flashlight cutting through the thick night air. The beam illuminated our campsite, but everything appeared normal. My friends were gathered around the fire, looking visibly shaken. "What happened?" I asked, stepping out into the cool night air. One of my friends, Sarah, looked pale as she explained that they had heard a strange growl coming from the direction of the woods. It was low and rumbling, unlike anything they had ever heard before. It sounded almost human, but not, she said, her voice trembling. The thought of a creature lurking in the shadows sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a mix of fear and curiosity urging me to investigate. As a group, we decided to venture toward the edge of the forest where the noise had originated. Armed with flashlights, we stepped cautiously into the darkness, the beam of light slicing through the thick underbrush. Each snap of a twig beneath our feet felt like a thunderclap in the stillness of the night. We walked in silence, hearts pounding, straining to listen for any sign of the creature. The air was heavy with tension, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the trees. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the darkness again, closer this time. The sound sent us into a panic, and we turned to head back toward the safety of the campsite. But as we retreated, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. It was a shadowy figure standing among the trees, its body slender and elongated. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, locking onto mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I froze, unable to look away as it tilted its head, studying us as if we were the prey. In that moment, the stories of the Wendigo flooded my mind. The creature's gaunt form matched the descriptions I had heard, and the fear gripped me like a vice. I turned and ran, calling out to my friends as I sprinted back toward the campfire. We all scrambled back, hearts racing, breathless from fear and adrenaline. Once we reached the safety of the clearing, we huddled together, casting frantic glances into the dark forest behind us. We stayed up the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, sharing our thoughts on what we had seen. The air was electric with fear, and the campfire flickered ominously as we told each other our theories. Maybe it was just a bear, we told ourselves, or perhaps it was another camper playing a prank. But deep down, we all knew we had experienced something far more unsettling than any of us wanted to admit. As dawn broke and the first light of morning pierced through the trees, we packed our gear and left the campsite in haste. The shadows of the night still clung to our thoughts as we drove away, and I couldn't help but glance back at the woods one last time. The memory of those glowing eyes and the chilling growl haunted me, a constant reminder that some legends hold more truth than we are willing to acknowledge. Even now, whenever I find myself near a dense forest, I think back to that night and the creature we encountered. It's a tale that has become part of my personal lore, a reminder that there are things in the world that we cannot explain, lurking just beyond the edge of our understanding. The Wendigo remains etched in my mind, a cryptid that serves as a warning to those who dare to venture too deep into the unknown. Lately, I've been struggling with bouts of insomnia, and last night's full moon certainly didn't help matters. It felt like no matter what I did, sleep was just out of reach. After what seemed like hours of tossing and turning, I finally managed to settle into a comfortable position. I was determined not to move, convinced that if I stayed perfectly still, I'd eventually drift off. I wrapped myself tightly in my winter duvet, lying on my right side with my back turned to the window. That's when I realized I hadn't fully closed the curtains, and the moonlight was streaming in, illuminating the wall in front of me. For a moment, I considered getting up to fix it, but exhaustion won out. I sighed to myself, resigned. I just needed to sleep. That's when I noticed it. A shadow on the wall, faint at first but unmistakable. It looked like the silhouette of a hand, or more accurately, a claw. Its fingers were crooked and gnarled, twisting unnaturally. The sight of it sent a jolt of fear through me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The shadow was distorted but eerily clear. 5 long fingers, a narrow wrist. Every instinct in me screamed that something was terribly wrong. Some deep, primal part of my brain knew this was no ordinary shadow. All I had to do was turn my head, just a quick glance over my shoulder, and I'd know exactly what was casting that shape. But in that moment, there was nothing I wanted to do less. I couldn't bear the thought of looking. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle tense. Something told me that any movement, any shift in my position would provoke whatever was there. The shadow swayed gently, as though it were alive, and I held my breath, convinced that if I made even the slightest noise, it would reach out and grab me. Just as my mind was racing with fear, I noticed my cat. He had been curled up at the foot of the bed, peacefully asleep, but now he was sitting bolt upright. His amber eyes were wide and unblinking, staring intently at the wall just above where I lay. His sudden stillness unnerved me even more, confirming that something was wrong. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that if I couldn't see it, maybe it would go away. When I woke the next morning, the relief was overwhelming. Sunlight streamed into the room, and the terror from the night before felt distant, almost absurd in the bright light of day. Still, I found myself in the exact same position I had fallen asleep in, every muscle stiff from the tension of staying so still for so long. I cautiously sat up and glanced around. The wall was empty, bathed in soft morning light, no sign of the claw-like shadow. Emboldened by the safety of daylight, I turned around to finally confront whatever had terrified me so much. To my surprise, on the cabinet above my bed I saw a set of clothes hangers. Their odd shapes and sizes, combined with the moonlight, had cast the eerie illusion. I laughed at myself as I took them down, feeling foolish but relieved. I had been cleaning out my closet the day before, and must have left them there without a second thought. Later that day, I recounted the story to some of my coworkers. They had a good laugh at my expense, teasing me for being scared of a few hangers. It felt good to talk about it, though, to turn what had been a night of terror into something lighthearted. I even started to feel a little silly for how frightened I had been, but deep down, I knew that fear had felt all too real in the moment. That night, sleep came more easily. I was exhausted from the previous night's ordeal, and the rational part of me knew that there was nothing to fear. But even so, that primal fear still lingered in the back of my mind. I had read somewhere that this kind of instinct is our subconscious warning us, sensing things we're not fully aware of. As I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't quite shake that feeling. Still, I was tired enough that I soon found a comfortable position and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Hours later, I woke up in the middle of the night, the room still cloaked in darkness. I groggily reached for my phone, curious to see how much time I had before my alarm went off. As I shifted in bed, my heart suddenly froze. It was still there, clear as day, even in the darkness. The same twisted shadow, its crooked fingers splayed out on the wall, reaching for me once again. He pulls his cab to a stop at the curb, the engine humming quietly as he glances at the rearview mirror. The woman in the back seat has fallen asleep, her head leaning gently against the window, her breathing steady. She had given him an address, one he recognized, but now as they sit there, her peaceful slumber leaves him uncertain of what to do next. He doesn't want to wake her right away. Maybe she just needs a few more minutes. For a while, he waits, the silence of the car heavy around him. Eventually, he turns in his seat, softly calling out to her, "Miss?" There's no response. He tries again, louder this time, but the woman remains still. A knot of worry begins to form in his stomach. He steps out of the car, the cool air biting at his skin as he walks around to the back door. Gently, he taps on the window, hoping the sound will stir her. Still nothing. His heart rate picks up as he opens the door and leans inside. "Miss?" His voice shakes a little now. She doesn't move. He reaches out, his hand hovering above her shoulder, unsure if he should touch her. The stillness feels wrong. Something inside him clenches, dread crawling up his spine. He touches her arm, lightly at first, and feels the coldness. It's a deep, unnatural cold, one that immediately sends panic flooding through him. He jerks his hand back as though burned. She's not just asleep, she's gone, completely, unmistakably gone. He stumbles backward, breath coming in ragged gasps as he stares at her. His mind races. His first instinct is to call the police. That's the right thing to do, isn't it? But a dark, creeping fear whispers in the back of his mind. They won't believe you. He's a cab driver, a nobody. What is he supposed to say? That the woman got in, alive, and then somehow died while he was driving? Who's going to buy that? The thought of trying to explain it, of being interrogated under harsh lights, makes his hands shake uncontrollably. They'll think he did something. They'll lock him up. And even if they don't, who would believe him? His pulse thunders in his ears. No one's going to believe you. He imagines the headlines, the gossip, the judgment. It feels inevitable. Before he realizes what he's doing, he's already back in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. His knuckles are white, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and guilt. He turns the key in the ignition, and the engine growls to life. He drives. He's barely paying attention to where he's going, his mind clouded with panic. His hands are trembling so much that he struggles to keep the car straight. At a red light, another cab driver pulls up beside him, shouting something about how he's swerving all over the place. The words barely register, but when the man sees his tear-streaked face, the anger fades. Instead of cursing him out, the driver softens. "Hey man, it's okay," he says gently. "It's no big deal, all right? We all have rough nights." The kindness in his voice breaks something in him, and the tears come harder now. He can't explain why. He can't explain any of it. But he keeps driving, trying to escape from the weight of the situation. The world outside is a blur. He doesn't even notice the exact moment the city gives way to the quieter outskirts. The streets become emptier, and soon he's on an open road, speeding toward the hills. The thought forms in his mind before he can stop it. An accident could make this all go away. One wrong turn, one slip of the wheel, and it would be over. No questions, no explanations, no guilt. But the thought terrifies him even more. He doesn't have the courage for that, not yet. He pulls into the parking lot of a supermarket. The lot is deserted, the fluorescent lights flickering above him. He's not entirely sure why he stopped, but in his panicked state, he decides he needs something to dig. If he can't call the police, maybe he can... He doesn't even finish the thought. He just knows he needs to get rid of the body. He shuts off the car, and before stepping out, he glances back at the woman. "Don't go anywhere," he mutters, the absurdity of his words striking him almost immediately. She's not going anywhere. He feels like a fool. Inside the store, he moves through the aisles in a daze, grabbing the first shovel he sees. It's red, oddly bright and cheerful in his hands, a stark contrast to the darkness in his mind. He pays without a word, avoiding the cashier's gaze, and heads back to his car. It's night by the time he reaches the hills. There are eucalyptus and lemon trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. The lemon trees have thorns, and they scrape against his skin as he walks, but he barely feels it. The pain hasn't sunk in yet. His body is running on autopilot, disconnected from the horror of what he's doing. He digs. The ground is hard, and it takes longer than he expected. His hands blister, his arms ache, but still he digs. The hole is shallow, barely enough. But it will have to do. He goes back to the car to retrieve the woman, but when he opens the door and sees her again, something inside him recoils. He can't do it. He can't bring himself to touch her. Instead, he slides into the back seat next to her, sitting there in the quiet. He glances at her from the corner of his eye, but can't bring himself to meet her gaze. The lifeless, empty stare makes his skin crawl. In his mind, he pictures her spirit. Her ghost, perhaps. Hovering above him, her eyes hollow, accusing, like a child refusing to close her eyes even as she falls into darkness. With trembling hands, he reaches out, avoiding her face as much as he can, and gently closes her eyes. Her skin is ice cold, like the surface of a frozen lake. A shiver runs through him. Exhausted, emotionally drained, he slumps against the seat. At some point, sleep overtakes him. He dreams of an ice rink, the kind he's seen in movies, but the ice is black and he has no skates. He doesn't even know how to skate, and yet there he is, slipping and stumbling, the cold seeping into his bones. It feels endless. The sharp rays of the morning sun jolt him awake. He sits up, disoriented, the car now filled with daylight. He turns to the seat next to him and finds it empty. The woman is gone. He's alone.